She was just the housekeeper's daughter, quiet, invisible, never meant to be noticed. He was a billionaire, broken by silence, obsessed with a game no one else seemed to understand. But one accidental glance at a chessboard would change everything. In a world of power and privilege, a child no one saw is about to become the one person he can't ignore. Secrets buried for over a decade will rise. Bonds will form where love was once forgotten. And a single word, Dad, will carry more weight than any checkmate ever could. Stay with us until the end to witness a story of identity, healing, and the unexpected ways family finds its way back. The small sound, barely more than a click, drew Charles Davenport's attention like a gunshot would have. It wasn't the noise itself that startled him, but the impossibility of it. He knew that sound. The crisp, deliberate placement of a weighted chess piece on solid marble. No one touched that board without permission. He stood up from his leather chair, the one he had inherited from his father, and turned the corner of the hallway into his private library. What he found made him stop mid-step. There, seated cross-legged on the carpet like she belonged to a different world, was a girl, 10, maybe 11, leaning toward his Russian chessboard with a focus so deep she didn't even notice him enter. Her fingers hovered above a golden rook, eyes narrowed, brows furrowed in absolute stillness. The girl wasn't Olivia. No ballet flats, no expensive cardigan, no familiar pout. She wore sneakers with frayed laces and a faded hoodie with a tear in the sleeve. Her name, he remembered after a second, was Isabel. Izzy, the housekeeper's daughter. And she was completely, astonishingly oblivious to the fact that she was trespassing on sacred ground. When Izzy finally sensed his presence, it was like watching a dream shatter mid-flight. She jolted, nearly knocking over the knight she'd just moved. Her eyes widened, not in defiance or arrogance, but with a quiet kind of panic, like a bird caught with one wing in a trap. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, standing up too fast. Her small palms lifted as if to prove her innocence. "I didn't touch anything. I was just looking. I didn't mean to." Her voice trembled with the effort of restraint, and Charles noticed her clenching her fists behind her back, perhaps to stop them from shaking. She was clearly used to being reprimanded, or worse, ignored. But what stunned him more was not her fear. It was the board. She hadn't disturbed the pieces at random. They were arranged in the middle of a real opening, the Nimzo Indian defense to be exact. A line only serious players used. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance, it was intuition. Charles slowly approached the table, glancing down at the board with growing curiosity, then looked at her. "Do you like chess?" he asked, his voice low but even. She hesitated. I think I do." Her answer was quiet, honest. There was something else in her expression too, something he rarely saw, even in his own daughter's eyes. Hunger. Not the kind that asks for food, but the kind that begs for meaning. "Do you know how to play?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Izzy swallowed and gave a tiny nod. "A little. We learned the moves at school, just with paper boards. I never played with real pieces before." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Paper?" She nodded again, shrinking under the weight of his attention. "I like the way they move," she added, almost to herself. "Like they're alive and they all have different jobs." That was the moment. The way she said it, like the board had whispered its secrets to her. Not through memorization, but understanding. It reminded him of when he was a boy, sitting at his grandfather's table, learning that chess wasn't about war or winning. It was about rhythm, about breath, about knowing when to wait. "Come here," he said suddenly, pulling out the opposite chair. "Let's play a game." She blinked at him, stunned. "Me? Unless you see another grandmaster hiding in the curtains," he replied dryly. Something in his tone made her smile. Elena's voice echoed faintly from the hallway, calling for her daughter, but Izzy didn't move. She sat slowly, as if afraid the chair might vanish beneath her. Charles began setting up the pieces, taking the black side out of habit. "You go first," he said, gesturing to the board. Izzy hesitated only a second before moving the queen's pawn forward 2 squares. He nodded with satisfaction. The queen's gambit. Bold. The game progressed slowly at first, with Charles explaining each move in simple terms, though he quickly realized he didn't need to. She didn't just memorize patterns, she understood the tension of the board, the push and pull. When he captured her bishop, she looked not flustered but focused. When she sacrificed a pawn to control the center, he leaned back in his chair, almost smiling. She wasn't playing like a child. She was playing like someone who saw 10 moves ahead, 10 moves into a world she had never even been invited into. About halfway through, she set a trap that nearly worked. Her knight, tucked quietly behind 2 pawns, sprang out to fork his rook and bishop. He barely avoided the ambush. When he neutralized the attack, she sat back and bit her lip, but didn't seem upset. She was thinking again. Already rebuilding. Charles studied her face in those moments of silence. There was no impatience, no fear of losing, only deep calculation. And something else, joy, a rare kind, the one born not from approval or reward, but from genuine connection. Olivia had never smiled like that in this room. Not once. For years, he had tried to pour his love into games she didn't want to play, music, theater, things he clapped for but never understood. But here, with this girl who wasn't even his, who wasn't supposed to be anything but invisible, here was the spark, the brilliance, a mind that danced where his daughters did not. By the time the game ended, his win, but barely, Charles wasn't smiling in victory. He was staring at the board, then at her, then back again, as if trying to name the feeling rising inside him. Pride? Awe? Guilt? He couldn't tell. Izzy looked up at him shyly. "Did I do okay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and reset the pieces with deliberate care, then looked her in the eyes and said simply, "Do you want to play another?" Her whole body lit up, but she masked it with a small nod. Before they could begin again, Elena's voice rang louder from the hallway, closer this time. Izzy stood up abruptly. I should go. My mom's calling." She backed away from the table, her hands trembling slightly. Charles leaned forward, fingers grazing a pawn. "Izzy," he said. She paused. "Yes, sir?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Same time tomorrow?" She didn't speak, but her smile said everything, and before she left, she reached out, just for a second, and touched the white queen again. The soft clack echoed one more time as it landed in its square. The sound of a piece falling. By the end of that week, their accidental chess game had turned into a quiet ritual. Izzy no longer waited for permission. After her mother entered through the service door and disappeared into her daily rhythm of dusting and folding and wiping, Izzy made her way, step by step, to the library. There was always a pause, just outside the threshold, where she hesitated, her fingers brushing the wood of the doorframe. And every time, Charles would glance up from his desk and give a simple nod. That was all. No grand invitation, no fuss. Just a space that was no longer forbidden. She'd sit, always in the same chair, across from him, and the pieces would be waiting. She never asked who set the board up or how he always knew she'd come. Maybe she liked not knowing. What mattered was that when she was there, she didn't feel like the housekeeper's daughter. She felt like a player, and Charles, in turn, stopped seeing her as an interruption. With every game, he started seeing something else, a mind as precise and unpredictable as lightning. It wasn't just skill, it was instinct, and it frightened him in the way that only brilliance can. Meanwhile, Olivia drifted farther from his reach. Her days were a whirlwind of rehearsals, costume fittings, and strained piano practices. She was always busy, always somewhere else. When she was home, her voice was a mix of complaints and polite distance. "You didn't come to my rehearsal," she told Charles one evening over dinner. "I had a meeting," he replied, not meeting her eyes. She didn't push it. She never did anymore. What neither of them said out loud was that the gap between them wasn't new. It had been there for years. But now it was widening, and in its place something unexpected was growing. Charles found himself rearranging his schedule just to make sure he had a free hour in the afternoon. He hadn't done that for anyone in years, not even Olivia. He knew it, and the guilt sat quietly behind every move he made. But every time Izzy leaned forward and muttered, "Check," and his king found itself cornered, he forgot the guilt for a while. He remembered what it was like to be alive, to feel challenged, seen, and that terrified him just as much as it thrilled him. Izzy never asked for more. She didn't ask for snacks or praise or attention. She didn't even ask to win. She only asked for one thing. "Can we play again?" And the answer always was yes. Their sessions grew longer. She began studying famous openings without knowing they were famous. She once played a variation of the Sicilian defense without having a name for it. "How did you know that move?" Charles asked. She shrugged. It just felt right. She spoke like someone navigating intuition, not theory. She trusted her gut, and somehow her gut never failed her. Charles, who had spent decades mastering the game, found himself outmaneuvered more than once by a child who had never read a single strategy book. He began to test her, setting traps, baiting pieces, using deceptive sacrifices. But she saw through him, not always, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to make him look at her and wonder what kind of brain was hidden behind those quiet eyes. And each time she surprised him, a quiet fear started to take shape. Not fear of her, but of the unknowns, about who she really was, where this gift came from, and why she looked at the board like she'd seen it in her dreams. Elena, for her part, kept her distance, but distance didn't mean ignorance. Every day she saw her daughter disappear into that room, and every day she watched her return with flushed cheeks and a spark in her eye she hadn't seen since Izzy was 5. Back then, Elena would catch her rearranging coins on the kitchen table, mimicking moves she'd glimpsed in a school textbook. But she had never encouraged it. She couldn't afford to. A single mother in someone else's house, raising a child with no place to belong. There were limits to what she could risk. Now, watching Charles and Izzy from the greenhouse window, she saw the danger and the beauty of what was unfolding. Charles didn't know. Not really. He didn't know the full story, the truth she had buried behind years of silence and loyalty, the truth that Izzy was more than just another bright child, and the truth that if he ever found out, everything would collapse. Eleanor folded towels with extra care, trying not to let her hands shake. She told herself this wouldn't last, that it couldn't, but deep down she feared the opposite, that maybe it was just beginning. What made it worse was how Charles had changed. His staff noticed it first. The late meetings pushed back, the untouched drinks in the evening, the fact that he didn't bark orders quite as often. When the boardroom asked about a quarterly review, he missed it, because Izzy had asked for just one more game. And Charles had said yes. Something had cracked in him, not broken, but shifted. He was smiling more. Not the kind of smile he wore at galas or charity balls. The stiff, practiced one. This smile was smaller, real. It came when he lost a knight to a clever fork, when Izzy explained a tactic in her own words, proud but humble. It came without thinking. Olivia noticed it too, though she said nothing. One afternoon, she passed by the library and caught a glimpse of them through the slightly open door. Her father, actually laughing, at something Izzy said. She stood there for a moment, unseen, clutching the ballet bag on her shoulder. Then she turned away. She didn't cry, but she felt something heavy settle in her chest, something she couldn't quite name yet, but would later recognize as the slow onset of being replaced. By the end of the second week, it was no longer a secret that Charles looked forward to his afternoons with Izzy more than anything else in his day. And Izzy, in her own quiet way, began to change too. She stood taller. She answered questions in full sentences instead of nods. She smiled with her teeth. Elena watched it all from behind the veil of her chores. Pride and fear waged war inside her. She should have stopped it. But how do you stop your child from discovering a part of herself that makes her whole? One evening, while wiping down the greenhouse counter, she caught their reflections in the glass. Charles leaning forward, Izzy leaning in. The board between them. A mirror of something fragile and impossible. She touched the window without thinking, her fingers leaving smudges on the glass. Behind it, a world was forming, one that she didn't belong to, one that could at any moment collapse if the truth came out. There were things Charles didn't know, things Izzy didn't even suspect. And if those truths surfaced, nothing, not even the magic of the game, would be enough to protect them. Elena observed from the greenhouse, torn between pride and fear, because Charles didn't know, not yet, and if he ever did, everything would change. Charles sat at the chess table that morning, barely pretending to focus on his side of the board. Izzy was silent as usual, her brows slightly pinched as she worked through her fourth move. He noticed how she tapped her thumb against her lip while calculating, how she squinted her left eye just slightly when planning an attack. It was that familiar look, the one he'd seen in old photographs of himself as a boy, back when his grandfather would challenge him at the dining room table with no mercy and no praise. Now, across from him, Izzy was building something, an elegant trap he hadn't seen until it was already sprung. She sacrificed a bishop, a move that looked careless at first. But then, 2 moves later, he saw it. Her knight rotated with precision, revealing a quiet coordination that closed off his rook, isolated his king, and forced a defense that left his entire flank exposed. He stared at the board, not because he was losing, but because he was watching something unfold that was both deeply foreign and hauntingly familiar. She didn't smile when he praised her. She only gave a small nod, then asked, "Can I try it again? But better." For the rest of the morning, Charles couldn't shake the image, not of the move itself, but of her face just before she made it. That slight furrow in her brow, that pause, the look of someone listening to something no one else could hear. He had done the same thing for years, before meetings, before interviews, before matches. There was no one else in his life who thought like that. Certainly not Olivia. She was brilliant in her own way, but musical, emotional, abstract. Izzy's mind worked in a straight line, a dangerous and deliberate geometry that didn't apologize for its sharpness. It was uncanny, unsettling even. He'd dismissed the resemblance before. Dark hair, sharp features, almond-shaped eyes. Coincidence. But now he was noticing too much. The way she tilted her head while thinking, the way she didn't speak unless it mattered, the way she stayed calm when she lost, like she was collecting information for the next round instead of taking it personally. All of it built to a question that pulsed louder with every session they shared. Who was this girl, really? And why did she feel so strangely familiar? By midday, Charles had stopped pretending he didn't need to know. He waited until Izzy and Elena left, Elena with her quiet, practiced goodbye, and Izzy with a final glance back at the chessboard, like she didn't want to leave it behind. Once the house was quiet again, Charles walked to his office, locking the door behind him with a firmness that startled even him. He hadn't done this in years, dug through old archives, paper records, names that belonged to another version of himself. He typed quickly at first, then slowed as the pieces started to fall into place. Elena Morales. That name, once vague, now snapped into sharp focus. She had worked for him, briefly, 10 years ago. Not in housekeeping, not in silence. She had been an intern in the legal department, smart, soft-spoken, sharp with contracts, if he remembered correctly. He frowned, suddenly uncomfortable. That wasn't the kind of detail he should remember after a decade. But he did. She had caught his attention back then, not because she had asked for it, but because she didn't. She kept her head down, but her work spoke loudly, and then, as quickly as she'd arrived, she was gone. No explanation, no resignation letter, just gone. He remembered now. The day she left, she'd looked at him with the strangest expression, like she wanted to say something, but had already decided it was safer not to. At the time, he assumed it was professional. Maybe she got another offer. Maybe she'd realized she didn't belong in the corporate world. He hadn't thought much of it. He didn't ask. He didn't chase. He moved on, because that's what men like him were taught to do. But now, pulling out an old personnel folder from the bottom of a locked cabinet, he found it, her ID badge, clipped to a copy of her internship approval form. And behind it, tucked almost carelessly, was a printed photograph. Not an official one. Personal. Grainy. Elena, in a blue sweater, smiling, genuine, tired, young, and beside her, barely visible in the frame, was the unmistakable outline of a crib. His chest tightened, not because of what he saw, but because of what he suddenly remembered. A party, a mistake, a blurred weekend that neither of them talked about afterward. The timing, the silence, the sudden disappearance, it all slammed into him like a final move he should have seen coming. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the photograph, eyes wide, not with panic, not even with guilt yet, just disbelief. All this time, all these years, Izzy, Elena's daughter, that would make her. He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. The air in the room shifted around him. Even if the windows stayed closed, he looked again at the photograph, at the face of a woman who had once worked 2 floors beneath him. Then he looked over at the chessboard in the corner of his office. It was a replica of the one in the library, though he hadn't used it in years. Suddenly, he remembered how Izzy had touched the knight on their first day playing together, not with awe, but with something like recognition. He had brushed it off then. Now he couldn't. Because the game had told him something long before the evidence had. The way she played, the way she calculated, the way she moved like she belonged to the board, just like he did. And in that moment, alone in his office, surrounded by files and decisions and a decade's worth of silence, Charles felt the truth settle with full weight on his shoulders. Izzy wasn't just gifted. She wasn't just the daughter of his housekeeper. She wasn't a coincidence, a fluke, a strange alignment of fate. She was his daughter. He whispered the name, first hers, then Elena's, as if trying it on for the first time, as if saying it might make it more real. But the room stayed silent, offering no reassurance. He sat there, photo in hand, heart clenching with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not regret, not yet. Something deeper. Recognition. And as the chessboard loomed behind him like a memory etched in marble, Charles realized what the game had been trying to say all along. Izzy wasn't just brilliant, she was his. Charles didn't wait. He asked Elena to meet him in the study, the photo still in his hand, his pulse uneven but his voice steady. She entered hesitantly, wiping her hands on her apron like she always did when she was nervous. But this time, there was no chore to return to. Just truth. He didn't wave the photo at her, didn't raise his voice or make demands. He simply held it out, wordless, like an offering or an accusation, or both. She looked at it, and her shoulders sank instantly, like she had expected this moment to come, but prayed it never would. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't true. Charles didn't speak. He studied her, his mind still trying to connect the Elena he barely remembered with the woman who had raised a daughter in silence under his roof. "Why?" was all he finally said. Not "how could you?" Not "is it true?" Just that single word, and it was enough. Her throat tightened, her hands trembled. The years she had buried, the choices she had made, the fears she had swallowed, suddenly they all came loose, spilling forward. Elena sat, not because she was invited, but because her knees gave out beneath her. She took a deep breath and started speaking, not fast, not dramatically, but with the kind of honesty that costs something. I was young. I was scared. You were powerful, unreachable. You never looked at me like I was real, just another intern. And when I found out, she paused. You don't understand what it meant to be alone in my position. I wasn't just working for you, I was surviving around you. Her voice broke, and she clasped her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. I didn't think you'd believe me or care, and even if you did, I didn't want her to grow up thinking she was a mistake you had to fix. That hit Charles hard. He turned away, gripping the back of his chair as if it could steady the guilt rising in his chest. He hadn't remembered her as cruel or manipulative. He had simply forgotten her. Like so many people in his orbit, she'd been invisible until now. And now, he couldn't stop seeing her. She told him about the birth, about moving back in with her mother, about raising Izzy on nothing but second-hand books and night shifts. She learned chess from a school teacher who gave her a broken board, Eleanor said, her voice thick. She would draw missing pieces on paper and cut them out. That's how she played until she could save up for a real set. Charles sat down slowly, the photo still clenched in his hand. His mind reeled, not because he doubted Elena's story, but because of how vividly he could now see it all unfolding in parallel to his own life of excess. You could have come to me, he said finally, and this time his voice cracked. Elena shook her head. I didn't want her to grow up in your shadow. I didn't want her to feel like she had to earn your name. There it was, the reason behind the years of silence. Not spite, not revenge, just fear, wrapped in the love of a mother trying to protect her child from a world she thought would never want her. Charles buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in a decade, he cried. Neither of them noticed the door, not fully closed, not enough to block out the sound of Elena's voice or the heavy silence that followed every truth confessed. Just outside, standing with her back against the hallway wall, Izzy listened. Her small hand pressed against her chest as if to keep her heart from breaking open. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. The words were heavy, complicated, mistake, shadow, alone. But their meaning was crystal clear. Her world had changed before her next breath. She wasn't just the girl who played chess with the man in the big house. She was his, and that truth, now spoken aloud, didn't feel like something wonderful. It felt enormous, dangerous, beautiful, too big for her 10-year-old frame. She slid down to the floor, silent, her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She was still figuring out if this was something to mourn or something to treasure. Inside the study, the storm of emotion softened. Charles reached for Elena's hand across the table, not out of romance or guilt, but something raw, recognition. He wasn't angry. He couldn't be, because in the end, the pain wasn't just hers. It was his too. He had missed a decade of his daughter's life, not because he was cruel, but because he hadn't known where to look. And now that he did, he didn't know how to begin again. She's extraordinary, he said softly. Elena nodded, her eyes glistening. She always has been. They sat in silence, two people bound by a shared mistake and a shared miracle. Neither moved to open the door. They weren't ready, but they knew they'd have to. Eventually. There were still decisions to make, conversations to have. A little girl waiting outside who had just heard the entire truth, but for now they just sat with it. And when Charles finally rose and opened the door, everything stopped. Izzy was there, exactly where he feared, and hoped she wouldn't be. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They just looked at each other, the way two people do when the rules of their story have changed forever. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was simply there, eyes wide, face pale, heart open. And in that long, wordless exchange between father and daughter, through the ache, through the recognition, through the quiet collapsing of old truths, the game had changed for good. Olivia Davenport had always understood her place in the world without needing it spelled out. She was the daughter of Charles Davenport, gifted in her own way, nurtured by tutors, praised when she excelled in recitals, and admired by family friends for her poise. But recently, something intangible had shifted. It wasn't anything her father had said outright. It was the way his eyes lingered on Izzy when she played. It was the way he laughed with her, a laugh Olivia hadn't heard in years, light, unguarded, real. It was how he instinctively knew how she liked her tea, chamomile with honey, no lemon, something he'd never once gotten right with Olivia despite the dozens of times she'd reminded him. These weren't grand gestures, but they pierced more deeply than any loud declaration. Olivia noticed everything. She always had. And now what she saw made her chest burn in a way she didn't know how to name. Her father had found someone who mirrored his silences, his intensity, his genius, and it wasn't her. The realization came slowly but settled heavily. It wasn't Izzy's fault, Olivia told herself, not really, but jealousy doesn't operate under logic. She saw it in the way Charles rested his hand gently on Izzy's shoulder after a well-played game, something he'd never done to her after a recital, not even when she sang flawlessly in front of their entire extended family. She saw it in the way he listened to Izzy speak, eyes steady, patient, so different from the distracted nods she was used to getting. Olivia had spent years trying to impress him with her voice, her performances, her perfection. But it had always felt like she was trying to reach a man who had built a fortress around himself. And now, here came Izzy, quiet, reserved, and suddenly holding a key Olivia never had. The bitterness rose before she could stop it. That evening, she stormed into the kitchen, tears threatening to fall. "She has something I never did," she snapped, slamming her music folder on the table. Her mother turned from the sink, startled. "Not talent," Olivia added, her voice cracking. "Attention." Elena, always restrained, felt the blow of those words with a different kind of ache. She knew Olivia had no idea what she was truly saying. And yet, there was a truth in it that hurt. "Sweetheart," she said gently, approaching Olivia. "Your father, he's trying." Olivia shook her head, bitter. "He's trying now, for her. I spent years trying to get him to look at me the way he looks at her when she moves a pawn." Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to speak as the housekeeper or something more. "He's learning how to be a father," she said at last. "Sometimes we don't get the timing right. That doesn't mean you were never loved," but the words felt hollow. Olivia wasn't grieving a lack of love. She was grieving the absence of being seen, of being known, not for her perfection, but for who she was beneath it. And now that she saw Izzy being seen that way, it stung more than she could admit. She didn't want to hate her. But how could she not, when it felt like Izzy had stepped into a place that once belonged only to her? Later that night, Olivia saw the light from the garden flickering through the window. Curiosity pulled her outside more than intention. What she found stopped her cold. Izzy was curled up by the hedge, clutching the wooden chessboard to her chest like it was a lifeline. Her cheeks were stained with tears, but she didn't sob. She just sat, holding the thing that had made her special, now uncertain whether it had brought her closer to something or shattered everything around her. Olivia stayed at a distance, torn between anger and empathy. She could have walked away. She almost did. But something in the shape of Izzy's small shoulders, hunched not in pride but in pain, made her pause. This wasn't the Izzy she'd built up in her head. This wasn't the girl who'd stolen her spotlight. This was just a girl, scared, lost, And maybe, just maybe, hurting just as much. Olivia looked at the chessboard again and wondered how a game of kings and queens could cause so much damage in a house already ruled by silence. She walked toward her before her mind could catch up. Izzy didn't look up. Olivia sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just being there. The board between them was a battlefield, but tonight it was also a bridge. Izzy's breathing slowed, and she wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, still not speaking. Olivia wanted to say something sharp, something to regain the upper hand. But the truth was, she had no moves left. Not against her. Not tonight. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to know that none of this was simple. None of this was fair. They were both just trying to make sense of a story written by people who hadn't known how to tell the truth until it was too late. "You're not the only one figuring things out," Olivia said quietly, her voice more fragile than she meant it to be. Izzy turned slightly, eyes wide. Still, neither of them moved away. And that's how it ended. Two girls, a board between them, silence shared like a language they both suddenly knew. Olivia didn't forgive, Izzy didn't apologize, but they sat side by side, in a space where rivalry gave way to something quieter, something closer to understanding. And in that stillness, with no game in progress and no winner to name, Olivia hesitated, and for the first time simply sat next to her in silence. When Charles proposed the idea, both girls blinked at him in disbelief. "You want us to—" "What?" Olivia asked, her brow furrowing as she looked at the board already set on the coffee table. Izzy, standing beside her, didn't speak, but her posture was just as confused. "Play together," Charles said calmly, gesturing to the white side of the board. "You two versus me." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. There was no hidden strategy, no deeper riddle to decode, only a bridge disguised as a chess game. Olivia exchanged a glance with Izzy, who gave the faintest shrug. Neither of them objected. That alone felt like a small miracle. Charles sat back and waited. After a brief, almost awkward silence, Olivia walked around the table and took the seat to the left. Izzy followed, sitting to the right. They didn't look at each other, but the decision had been made. It was an odd arrangement, two girls still unsure how to exist side by side, now being asked to think as one. "White to move," Charles said, tapping the clock. Olivia hesitated before nudging a pawn forward. The game had begun. The first match was clumsy. Olivia and Izzy whispered over each move, stepping on each other's strategies, occasionally undoing what the other had just built. "That wasn't what I meant," Izzy mumbled after Olivia advanced the bishop instead of holding position. "Well, maybe next time say something before I move," Olivia snapped, then instantly regretted the sharpness in her voice. Charles said nothing, merely observing. There was no triumph in watching them fumble. He was giving them space, not just to play, but to learn each other's rhythms. And slowly, without them realizing it, a kind of silent language began to form. On the second match, the tension was less pronounced. Izzy deferred to Olivia on opening structure. Olivia, in turn, asked Izzy whether they should defend the center or go aggressive. There was a rough kind of teamwork emerging, fragile, awkward, but undeniably present. Charles noticed. He leaned back, keeping the pressure consistent, but not overwhelming. The idea wasn't to win. It was to let them discover what they could be, together. By the third game, something unexpected happened. They started laughing, not big rolling laughter, just small, unguarded chuckles. When Olivia accidentally dropped a rook between two squares and muttered, "Oops, classic me," Izzy giggled and quipped, "The rook panicked." Olivia glanced at her, surprised, not by the humor, but by how easy it felt. Charles pretended not to notice, but inside, something unclenched. His daughters were talking, not arguing, not sulking, just being. It didn't matter that the match was messy, or that their combined tactics made little logical sense. What mattered was the softening, the letting go of sharp edges. They began checking in with each other, waiting before moving, learning each other's instinctual patterns. Olivia played with instinct and flair. Izzy played with structure and foresight, and slowly they started to complement one another. Each mistake turned into a conversation. Each move became a shared decision. Chess wasn't just a battlefield anymore, it was becoming common ground. The match reached its climax in the middle of the fourth game. Charles had them on the ropes, pressing hard with a queen-rook combination. Izzy wanted to block. Olivia wanted to counterattack. For a second, they stared at each other, neither wanting to back down. But then, Olivia leaned in and whispered, "You see things I don't. Show me." Izzy's eyes widened, stunned by the trust. She adjusted the knight's position, rerouting a future trap. Charles raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. 2 moves later, Olivia executed a clever pin, leveraging Izzy's positioning. And suddenly, just like that, Charles found himself cornered. The match ended 5 turns later. Checkmate. The 2 girls stared at the board for a second, silent. Then Olivia burst out laughing. "We won?" Izzy nodded, her mouth open in shock. "We actually won." Charles stood and clapped once. "Well played," he said, "both of you." Izzy turned to Olivia, her face lit up with something more than pride. "You see what I don't," she said sincerely. It wasn't just a compliment, it was an acknowledgement, a gift. Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of being seen in return. Not for her talents, not for her voice, but for her contribution to something shared, something earned. She didn't respond with words. She just smiled, genuine, open, slightly sheepish, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. For the first time, the board between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a table set for 2, a place where strategy met instinct, where rivalry gave way to respect. Charles watched, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Something had clicked into place. And so, when Olivia reached forward and reset the board for another match, she didn't ask who wanted to go first. She just glanced at Izzy and said, "Let's do it again. Your move." The board was the same, the pieces unchanged. But now, they sat side by side, not as strangers or competitors, but as a team. And when they beat Charles together, Izzy looked at Olivia and smiled with genuine admiration. "You see what I don't see." Olivia blushed. For the first time, she accepted that maybe chess could be beautiful when played by 2. The night before the state youth chess tournament, Charles stood outside his study for longer than he expected, clutching the letter he had written for Izzy. He wasn't a man accustomed to sentimentality. His world had always been figures, forecasts, and flawless logic, but this letter was different. It had taken him 2 days and 5 torn-up drafts to find the right words. He read it one last time, fingers trembling slightly. "To my daughter, the champion the world doesn't know yet. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already made your mark, on the board and on me. D." The word daughter stared back at him like it had been waiting years to be said aloud. He thought about the first time he saw her staring at his chessboard, the defiance and fear in her eyes when he asked if she wanted to play. He thought about the weight of the silence that had lived between them before either of them even knew they were connected by blood. Taking a breath that felt far heavier than he intended, he knocked gently on her door and stepped inside. Izzy was seated at the small desk near her window, her hair loosely tied back, her chess pieces lined up in a travel case beside her notebook. She looked up as he entered, and something about her expression, wide-eyed, unsure, hopeful, told Charles that no opening move in any match could ever be as nerve-wracking as this moment. He didn't make a speech. He simply held out the envelope. "For you," he said quietly. "Before tomorrow." Izzy took it with both hands, careful and reverent, like it was something sacred. Her thumb brushed over her name written in his cursive, and for a moment she didn't move. She didn't open it. Instead, she placed it gently inside the velvet-lined pocket of her chess-piece case. "I'll read it after," she whispered. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes betrayed the emotion rising behind them. She looked at him, not seeking approval, not even asking questions. Just looking, like she was trying to memorize him, or maybe see him clearly for the first time. Charles sat on the edge of her bed, unsure if he was allowed to. She didn't stop him. "Do you feel ready?" he asked. She shrugged. "I'm nervous." "Good," he said, smiling slightly. "Nervous means it matters." He thought back to the many times he'd tried to instill confidence in Olivia through speeches, tactics, strategy. With Izzy, the air was different. Words weren't always necessary. Sometimes presence did more than advice ever could. "Whatever happens tomorrow, win or lose," he continued, "what you've built is yours. You earned it." Izzy's gaze didn't falter. "You're coming, right?" "I wouldn't miss it," he said. But it wasn't just a promise. It was an anchor. They were building something fragile and fierce at once, and both knew that missing even one moment now could undo so much. Izzy didn't respond. She just nodded and quietly picked up her king piece, rolling it in her fingers the way someone might fidget with a lucky coin. From the hallway, Olivia stood just out of sight, listening, not out of jealousy this time, but curiosity. She'd seen the envelope earlier that day, sitting on her father's desk, the top corner marked by his pen's hesitation. She hadn't read it, but she knew it was important. And part of her wanted it to exist, not just for Izzy, but for Charles too, because if he could say those words to Izzy, maybe, just maybe, he'd learn how to say them to her someday. She stepped away before they noticed her. There would be time. Right now, this moment wasn't hers. And for once, she was okay with that. She walked back to her room, humming under her breath, and sat by her own piano, letting her fingers find notes not from sheet music, but from memory. She had found her own way to speak, and tomorrow she would be in the crowd, cheering for a sister she never expected to have. Back in Izzy's room, Charles rose to leave. At the door he hesitated. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words low, sincere, deliberate. Izzy looked up. "Even if I lose?" "Especially if you do," he answered. Her eyes softened. It wasn't just the reassurance, it was the honesty. She opened her chess case again, not to prepare her pieces, but to check that the envelope was still there, safely tucked in place. She didn't need to read it yet. The weight of it alone gave her something she hadn't had before, a story of her own, written by the man who had unknowingly shaped so much of her life from a distance. That letter wasn't just a message, it was a door. And so, on the eve of her biggest match yet, with her nerves quietly tucked beneath determination, Izzy closed the case and looked at Charles with tearful eyes. She said nothing, just held his gaze. And in that silent exchange, there was something he had never shared with Olivia, a moment not of perfection, but reconciliation. And in that reconciliation, Charles finally understood that loving one daughter didn't mean loving the other less. It meant learning how to love better. Izzy could barely breathe when they called her name. The echo of it rolled through the hall, louder in her chest than in her ears. Around her, cameras flashed, pens scratched notebooks, and chess sets clicked as other players finished their rounds. But Izzy's match, the final, had gathered a crowd. It wasn't just the competitors or coaches anymore. Local reporters had arrived, curious about the 10-year-old wildcard who had entered the tournament without any major school or club backing her. She had no uniform, no sponsors, just her name, her travel set, and a borrowed clock. And yet here she was. Among the spectators, she spotted Olivia, holding a poster that said in big, colorful letters, "Go Izzy, show them your magic." The handwriting was clearly hers. Bright markers, glitter. the kind of thing made late at night by someone who cared more than she admitted. Izzy didn't wave. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too badly, but the sight rooted her, gave her something solid to hold onto that wasn't made of wood or ivory. The match began slowly. Her opponent, a tall boy from a prestigious prep academy, had years of tournament experience. His name had already been whispered as a favorite since the semi-finals. Izzy knew his style: aggressive, flashy, always hungry for early control. Charles had warned her about players like him. They try to win by pressure, not precision. She remembered those words with every move. Her fingers hovered over each piece longer than usual. Her first blunder came in the opening exchange. She sacrificed a bishop too early, and the boy smirked. But she didn't unravel. She studied the board, breathing slowly. With each move, the world outside faded. The crowd disappeared. There was no noise, no camera flashes, no Olivia's poster. Just 64 squares and the quiet rhythm of calculation. Her mind began to see the patterns again, the traps she had trained herself to recognize. She didn't rush. She let him push. Then she began to turn the tide. Midway through the match, the boy leaned back in his chair, frustrated. Izzy had reclaimed center control and forced him into defensive plays. When he attempted a risky rook trade, she punished him. But she didn't gloat. She didn't even meet his eyes. Her focus was absolute. Charles, from across the room, hadn't sat once. He stood with his hands folded tightly in front of him, a silent statue in a sea of shifting emotions. Elena stood a few feet behind him, clutching her coat. And Olivia. Olivia was chanting now, not loudly, just enough for Izzy to hear between moves. "Let them see you! Let them see you!" Izzy's fingers hovered over her queen. She had mapped out the next 5 moves. She knew how this ended. She waited, let the clock tick down another 30 seconds. Then she moved. The queen slid across the board and landed softly, but with finality. "Checkmate," she said, her voice low but steady. The room didn't react at first. The referee leaned in, confirmed the position, and raised his hand. Then the eruption came. Applause burst from every corner. Chairs scraped. Cameras clicked. Her opponent's face crumpled with disbelief. But Izzy didn't see him. Her eyes locked on Charles. He was still standing, but now his eyes were full, glistening in the artificial light. There was no clapping from him, only a look so rich in pride, pain, awe, and something older, something ancient, like redemption. Then she turned to Olivia, who had climbed up on her chair and was clapping over her head like a child who didn't know how else to be proud. Their eyes met. Olivia mouthed something. "You did it." Izzy didn't smile. Not yet. Her heart hadn't caught up to the moment. But her legs trembled, and she realized for the first time how much weight she had been carrying, not just in this game, but for years. Years of being quiet. Years of being looked through. The award ceremony came next, but Izzy barely heard her name being called. She walked up, accepted the trophy, posed for pictures she wouldn't remember. What she remembered was the quiet. After the noise, the stillness that came when everything was finally acknowledged. When everything inside no longer needed to prove itself. Olivia wrapped her arms around her as soon as she stepped down from the podium. "You were amazing," she whispered. Izzy finally smiled. Not because of the win, but because of what came with it. The crowd didn't matter. The trophy didn't matter. She had walked into that hall as the daughter of a housekeeper, the ghost of a family secret. But when she looked into Charles's eyes and Olivia's applause echoed in her ears, she wasn't either of those things. For the first time, Izzy felt seen, not as the maid's daughter, not as the lost daughter, but as herself. Charles had spent hours planning the dinner, though he would never admit it. Every dish on the table had been chosen with care, even if he didn't know what Izzy's favorites were yet. He guessed. He remembered that she liked strawberries and that she avoided anything too spicy. He asked Elena quietly, awkwardly, what kinds of things Izzy liked to eat. Elena had smiled for the first time in days and simply said, "She likes food made by people who care." That stayed with him. Now, as the house slowly filled with the scent of roasted vegetables and warm bread, Charles checked the placement of the plates again. He wasn't nervous about the food. He was nervous about what sat in the center of the table, wrapped in simple gold paper, tied with a red ribbon that Olivia had chosen. He didn't say much as they all sat down, Elena, Olivia, and Izzy. He barely ate. He only watched Izzy from across the table, memorizing the way her fingers moved, the shape of her nose, the sound of her laugh when Olivia made a joke about how burnt the bread was. All of it was new to him, and yet none of it felt unfamiliar. At first, Izzy was hesitant to open the gift. She glanced at her mother as if silently asking permission, then carefully undid the ribbon. Charles leaned forward without realizing. Inside the box, cushioned in dark velvet, was a wooden chessboard, an exact replica of the one in the library, but untouched, flawless, and impossibly beautiful. The pieces were weighty, carved with precision, and just beneath the board in golden script, one name was etched, for Isabel Davenport. For a moment, the room fell into a hush. Olivia gasped softly. Eleanor's eyes immediately filled with tears, though she kept her hands in her lap, twisting the napkin nervously. But Izzy simply stared at the name. Her eyes scanned it again and again. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was trying to understand what it meant, to see her name, the one she'd always answered to, now linked to a family she was still learning to belong to. She looked up slowly, meeting Charles's eyes. He didn't smile right away. He looked terrified, like he had just placed a piece on the board without knowing what it would cost him. "Is it okay?" he asked, his voice too soft for the man everyone thought was made of iron and marble. Izzy didn't answer right away. She ran her fingers over the name again, tracing the curve of the letters. She swallowed hard. "Why Davenport?" she asked, though her tone wasn't angry, just full of something much heavier. Charles set down his fork, cleared his throat, and tried to steady his hands under the table. "Because I want the world to know what I already know," he said, "that you are part of me, that I see you. And I want to give you what I should have given you from the beginning, a name, a place, a family." He paused, then added, "But it's yours to accept or not. There's no pressure, Izzy. None." She stared at him for a long time, quiet as ever. Then she glanced at Olivia, who nodded slightly as if to say, "It's okay, I get it now too." Elena stayed silent. It wasn't her moment to interrupt. Izzy finally spoke, her voice soft and unsure, as if she was afraid her words might tip the balance of something too fragile. Can I still be Morales too?" Her question hung in the air with so much innocence and weight that Charles felt his throat close up. It was such a simple thing to ask, and yet it carried decades of emotion, of identity, of loyalty, of loss and connection. He hadn't prepared for that. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a little girl asking permission, but a young soul trying to make sense of two worlds pulling at her heart. Charles stood slowly, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. "You can be whoever you want to be," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "Morales, Davenport, or both. What matters, what will never change, is that you're my daughter." His hand rested gently over hers on the table. She didn't pull away. The silence after that wasn't awkward. It wasn't cold or unfinished. It was full, filled with all the things they didn't know how to say yet, but would one day learn. Olivia reached out and pushed the plate of strawberries closer to Izzy, who gave a small smile and took one. Elena excused herself to the kitchen, probably to hide her tears. Charles returned to his seat, visibly calmer, though his eyes were still red. For the rest of the dinner, conversation flowed slowly. Olivia talked about a new song she was working on. Charles asked Izzy what she liked most about the final match. Izzy told a small story about how her opponent kept scratching his nose when he was bluffing. They all laughed. The kind of laughter that comes not from comedy, but from survival. Laughter as proof that they were still here, still trying. As the evening ended, Izzy closed the lid of the chessboard and held it against her chest. She looked at Charles, who was watching her again like he didn't want to blink and miss anything. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the board." Charles nodded. He didn't ask for more. He didn't need it. She had accepted the gift. She had seen the name and she hadn't rejected it. That was more than he'd hoped for. That was everything. When she repeated, "Can I still be Morales too?" And he answered, "You can be whoever you want, but what never changes is that you're my daughter." It was no longer about names. It was about belonging. It had been months since that first quiet encounter over a chessboard, but the memory of it lingered in all of them, like a soft echo, not haunting, but grounding. Now, in the very same library where the first piece had ever been touched by Izzy's hands, they found themselves gathered again. Not as strangers with separate lives, but as something far more fragile and real, a family learning to breathe together. Charles sat where he always did, but this time his posture was different, less rigid, less guarded. Olivia sat to his right, her hand resting comfortably near Izzy's, ready to move a piece or offer a smile. Izzy, in turn, was calmer than she'd ever been, not because the game was easy, but because something deeper had settled in her, belonging. Elena stood at the doorway, arms loosely crossed, her lips curved into a smile so subtle it might have been missed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't move closer. She simply watched, knowing that what unfolded in front of her wasn't just a match, it was a moment, when none of them would speak aloud, but all of them would carry for the rest of their lives. The match was casual in rhythm, but not in weight. There were moments of shared laughter, small debates over strategies, and even playful bickering between Olivia and Izzy about which move was smarter. Charles didn't lead the game. He didn't correct or dominate as he once might have. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, letting the girls navigate their own choices and missteps. "Try knight to f5, Olivia whispered once, leaning toward Izzy. "I was thinking bishop to e4, Izzy replied. Charles raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He was learning to enjoy the unpredictability. Izzy's face lit up when Olivia agreed. Actually, yeah, that could work. The game was no longer about winning. It was about rhythm, about learning to read one another's pauses, one another's hesitations. It was a duet played by three, and somehow it sounded like harmony. Elena watched it unfold like a painting finishing itself, stroke by stroke, piece by piece. Eventually, the pace of the game slowed, not because they were tired, but because they didn't want it to end. It was Charles who finally leaned back in his chair and said, "We're close to the end." Olivia nodded, but didn't move her piece. She looked at Izzy instead. There was something in her expression, an unspoken invitation. Izzy stared at the board, calculating not just moves, but meaning. She reached forward, her fingers brushing over the white queen. She moved it decisively across the board and placed it at the center. "Checkmate," she said softly. No one clapped, no one cheered. They didn't need to. Charles's eyes didn't leave her. Olivia smiled, wide and genuine. Elena's hand went to her mouth as if to catch the emotion rising in her chest. It wasn't the win that mattered. It was the way Izzy said it, with quiet certainty, with peace, as if some final note had landed, resolving a melody that had begun long before anyone realized they were part of the song. Izzy didn't stay seated. She stood slowly, looked around the room, and without saying a word, walked to the far wall. On the side of a small chalkboard usually used for shopping lists or reminders, she picked up a piece of white chalk. Charles started to say something, then stopped. Olivia leaned slightly forward, watching. Eleanor had taken a quiet step into the room now, closer than before, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Izzy stared at the board for a long time before her hand moved. She didn't rush. First, she drew a simple crown. Not overly detailed, but unmistakable. A queen. She added subtle lines, giving it balance and form. Then, just beneath it, she wrote in block letters, shaky but intentional. One word: family. It was not grand, it was not poetic, but it was honest. It was a declaration. Not just of what they were now, but of what they had chosen to become together. When she stepped back, no one spoke immediately. Charles stood, walked over and read the word as if it was sacred. Olivia joined him, slipping her hand into Izzy's without hesitation. Elena's eyes shone, though she didn't wipe the tears away. They were meant to be felt. Charles turned toward Izzy and said quietly, "That's the best move you've ever made." Izzy didn't answer. She didn't have to. It was all there, in the chalk lines, in the silence, in the way they stood not in pairs, but as one. In that moment, there were no missing pieces, no secrets waiting in shadows, no fears pulling at their edges. There was only this: a father, a mother, two daughters, and a game that had finally taught them how to win without defeating anyone. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. And so, as Izzy placed the last piece in the center of the board and looked around, at her sister beside her, her mother nearby, her father proud, the game truly ended. Not with a victor, but with everyone on the same side. We put a lot of care and heart into creating every story here, thinking especially of you who take the time to watch and feel with us. If this story touched you in any way, we'd love to hear what it meant to you in the comments. When you subscribe to our channel and like the video, you're not just supporting us, you're helping us keep bringing you more stories that matter. Each one takes days of work and love to bring to life. Thank you for being here with us. We're truly grateful to share these moments with you.